Regular followers of the Institute's work and NASA's work, in particular with the Kepler space mission, will know the name Bill Borucki, who is widely regarded as the father of the Kepler telescope. It was his paper many, many years ago that ultimately led to the launch in 2009 of the Kepler Space Telescope that has been one of the most profound and successful missions in NASA's history. Bill has been widely recognized for the work that he has achieved with the Kepler telescope. But for those of you old enough like me and some of the panelists here to remember the Apollo mission, Bill's first work in the 1960s was involved in designing the heat shield for the Apollo missions. So Bill has a long and storied career at NASA. Just a short list of the accolades and recognitions that Bill has received over the years. I won't read the long one because we don't have time. But in 2016, just recently in Philadelphia, Bill was awarded the Franklin Institute Bauer Award and Prize for Achievement in Science. We personally know that the most coveted award he received was in 2015 from the SETI Institute. That is the Frank Drake Award for Innovation in SETI and Life in the Universe Research. He was also the recipient of the 2015 Shaw Prize, which is a very prestigious prize, kind of the equivalent in Asia of the Nobel Prize. Other awards, and again, I won't read them all, but in 2015, the National Air and Space Museum Trophy for Current Achievement. In 2014, the National Space Club Robert H. Goddard Memorial Trophy. In 2013, the National Academy of Sciences Henry Draper Medal, also won by 8 Nobel Prize winners. So he's in good company. In 2012, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Space Science Award, and in 2012 also the SPIE Goddard Space Science Award, and on it goes. So rather than take up the next hour with the continuation of that, we wanted to recognize Bill with something special today, which was a photograph taken by our very own senior astronomer, Seth Shostak, sitting here to my left, who's not only an astronomer but a photographer of some note. So we had a very wonderful photograph of Bill taken by Seth that has been signed by many of us at the Institute, the science and executive staff of the Institute. So this is a gift for Bill, which he will pick up after the talk. And again, we're just so grateful to have Bill and his contributions to the work of the SETI Institute, to the broader understanding of life in the universe. So I think all of us can be very appreciative of Bill's achievements, and in particular, the Kepler mission. So here's to Bill Borucki. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to get the panel underway. Here's what we're going to do today. For those of you, again, who are regular followers of the talks, we typically have a speaker, very often from the SETI Institute. Often they are invited speakers from a wide range of topics, from aeronautics and space to astrobiology, astrophysics, and beyond. We record these. They're done every Tuesday right here at Microsoft at 12 noon in this very auditorium. They're open to the public, they're free of charge, and we encourage you, if you're interested in this area of science, to come and join us for that regular series. We also record them as YouTube videos. We will record today's session. Today's session is also being live streamed, which is a first for the SETI Talk series, so we're excited about that. But if you're interested in this series, you'll find over 360 lectures of a wide range of topics on our YouTube site, which we're very proud of. It's part of our heritage and part of what we give back to the community in terms of sharing the work we do at the Institute. So today's event, however, rather than the typical format of a single speaker, is a panel session. And the panel is going to be discussing a singular topic of when will we first find life beyond Earth. Now, notice we didn't say intelligent or technological life. We're still looking for that here. But we did say life, so there may be some discussions about what do we mean exactly by life. The only thing I'm wishing that we had done was, put some dates up, and we could have had like some sort of a contest. We just have to wait a few years probably to find out who won, but maybe not so long. So let me introduce today's panel of speakers to you. And their full biographies are all available on our website at SETI.org. But first to my left is Dr. Seth Shostak. He's our SETI senior astronomer. little quips and stories about each speaker. If you think they're witty and funny, you can credit them to me. If you don't like them, remember that I didn't write them. So Seth claims to have developed an interest in extraterrestrial life at the tender age of 10 when he first picked up a book about the solar system. This innocent beginning eventually led to a degree in radio astronomy, and now, as senior astronomy, Seth is an enthusiastic participant in the Institute's SETI observing programs. He is also the host of the SETI Institute's weekly science radio show, Big Picture Science, and is responsible for the outreach work that we do at the Institute. To Seth's left is Dr. Fergul Mulally. He's a member of the Kepler science team. He's the SETI Kepler science officer. Fergul Mulally is from Knockline, as they say in Ireland, from Knockline on the south side of Dublin, and he holds a degree in physics from the University College Dublin in Ireland and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Texas at Austin. He currently works for the Kepler space mission based at NASA's Ames Research Center at Ames, right down the street from us here, where he works on improving data analysis techniques for Kepler data. He's also a member of the Whole Earth Telescope, headquartered at Mount Cuba Astronomical Observatory in Delaware. To the left of Fergal is our own Dr. Natalie Cabral. Dr. Cabral is the director of the Carl Sagan Center for Science at the SETI Institute and a researcher in astrobiology in her own right. Natalie has been a principal investigator at SETI since 1998. She leads projects in planetary science and astrobiology, including science exploration strategies for Mars, Titan, and the outer solar system's icy moons. To help with these endeavors, Natalie explores high-altitude lakes in the Andes where environmental conditions are analogous to early Mars. With her team, she documents life's adaptation to extreme environments and its relevance to planetary exploration. And if I'm not mistaken, Nat, you also have the record for a woman for the highest altitude scuba dive. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Now, it's not a popular sport, which may explain, but nevertheless, it takes a special kind of person to lug all a diving gear up to 20,000-foot peaks and go looking for life under the lakes of these volcanic peaks. And that's what she's done. To her left, our very own Mark Showalter, Dr. Mark Showalter. He's a SETI Institute senior research scientist. Planetary astronomer Mark Showalter is rabid about rings. This is one of those lines where I said, if you don't like it, I didn't write it. Anyway, he's rabid about rings. While everyone knows about Saturn's spectacular ring system, it's often forgotten that Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune are also encircled by fainter and narrower rings. Recently, he was granted 3 more years to study the system of rings and moons orbiting Uranus and with the Hubble Space Telescope, a mission he's been leading off and on since 2002. This work has already led to the discovery of 2 small moons and 2 faint rings. You've probably heard us talk in the past about how Mark is credited with finding the 2 newest moons of Pluto, Kerbos and Styx. Mark says rings and the faint moons that interact with them serve as dynamical laboratories where we can observe some of the same processes that operate in galaxies and during the formation of planetary systems. So that is your panel today. They will again be talking about when we will first find life beyond Earth. So what do we need for life? It's widely believed that we need liquid water. We need access to a range of elements and minerals for metabolic activity to take place. We need energy, heat that can be exploited to power the chemical reactions needed to power life. So these are some of the basic ingredients that we think about when we talk about finding life beyond Earth. And then the question is, where will this be and when will it happen? So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over. We're going to have each speaker have 5 minutes to opine on this subject. We'll then have a little bit of discussion amongst the panel and myself, and then at the end we're going to open this up to questions from the audience. We hope to get some lively activity. We have a microphone set up here in front. What we ask is that you come up and line up behind the microphone and also be respectful that there's likely to be people behind you, so we won't be able to deal with extremely long questions. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Seth Shostak.
Okay, well, I want to thank Bill for that introduction, and also thank Microsoft for the lunch. He's already alluded to the fact that that may have dulled your brain. Actually, somebody in the audience said to me, you know, Seth, you're a perfect panelist for a postprandial occasion like this, because after I've had a big lunch, all my blood goes to my stomach, and you never say anything that requires it to get any higher. I'm going to talk a little bit about the search for intelligent life. My co-panelists will talk about the other kind. 8 years ago at a conference in Germany, I bet the audience a cup of Starbucks will find ET in the next 24 years. Now, this caused a kind of a dyspeptic reaction from many of my colleagues. I remember Jill Tarter's eyeballs rolled up like Linda Blair's. But on the other hand, I have to say that about 6 months ago, NASA's chief scientist actually said, we're going to find life within 20 years. So I guess she wants, you know, that cup of coffee too. Now, was I merely being provocative? Was I simply whistling past the graveyard? No. If you ask, when are we going to find anything? Well, for example, finding a needle in a haystack, and this endeavor has been likened to that. If you ask, how long will it take you to find that needle, Bob? Well, it depends on only 3 things. How big is the haystack? How fast are you going through the hay? And how many needles are in there anyway? And for SETI, we know 2 of the 3. We know how big the haystack is. We're looking in our galaxy, mostly in our galaxy. Secondly, we know how quick our experiments are, and they keep getting faster. This is something the public doesn't really understand. Thanks to developments in digital electronics, our ability to sift through the sky looking for signals is doubling roughly every couple of years. It's basically following Moore's law, and that will continue for a while. Now, this is all contingent upon funding, which is a large part of the reason you're sitting here today, right? This is all privately funded, the SETI work. But assuming that the funding can be found, what this means is that in the next 24 years, we will go through 1 million star systems. So that's like looking for that needle in the haystack and replacing a teaspoon with a skip loader, right? If you can go through the hay more quickly, you're going to find something sooner. So it was on that basis that I made this bet that we'll find something within 24 years, or you get a cup of coffee from me. My wife is buying Starbucks stock. All right. I would say that the chances here have probably been enhanced by the results that have been found by people like the Kepler team and so forth that give us some idea of how many habitable planets might be out there. The current wisdom is that maybe 1 in 5 stars has a world that could be a locale for life. Okay, 1 in 5. Now, maybe it's 1 in 2, maybe it's 1 in 20, but all those numbers are the same number. That means there are many, many, there are tens of billions of cousins of Earth out there. Now, at the SETI Institute, you see the Allen Telescope array there behind me. We're embarking on a program to look at 20,000 red dwarf stars. Now, you may wonder, what is red dwarf? Is that a British TV show? Red dwarf is, in fact, a very small kind of star, and it's the most common kind of star. Just like everywhere else in nature, there are more small things than big things. Okay, 3/4 of all stars are red dwarfs. So if you were to be plopped down into the middle of the savannas of Africa, you can bet that the average distance to the nearest ground squirrel is going to be less than the average distance to the nearest megafauna, you know, I don't know, an elephant and a lion, something like that. So if we look at 20,000 red dwarfs, instead of 20,000 stars like the sun, on average, they're going to be a factor of 2 closer, and that means a factor of 4 stronger signals. They're also they're dim bulbs. They're like my brothers, okay? These stars burn forever. Every red dwarf that's ever been born is still out there in its teenage years burning today. That means on average, these 20,000 stars on average are billions of years older than our sun. And this is one example I can think of where older might be better, because if you're older, you've had more time to cook up something that might be interesting. In any case, 15 to 50% of red dwarfs are thought to have habitable planets. There was an announcement of another red dwarf system yesterday with 3 planets. I think that they're a good place to look for ET, so we're going to be doing that. Let me sort of wind up here by saying, well, what would be the reaction? Because Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch, to the extent that I ever go to a cocktail party, will come up and say, once they learn what my job is, they'll say, so what happens if you find them? Would you even tell us? Right? Most people figured, no, the government would swoop down and shut you all down because they couldn't handle the news. What do you mean they couldn't handle the news? 1/3 of them believe the aliens are here, right? and they're not terribly discomfited by that thought. So I don't think that that's it. We have had a false alarm. Joe can tell you all about it. In 1997, for most of the day, we thought maybe we had found something, and nobody was interested, right? The mayor of Mountain View didn't even show up, right? The only thing that happened was at 9 in the morning when I was asleep at my desk, one of the science reporters from the New York Times called up. So that was the interest. So that's what will really happen. It will be a tremendously big story, but we won't have a message. We won't know what they're saying. That's an artifact of the technology used to search. that would require building a much, much bigger instrument, but I think at that point money would not be an issue. So bottom line, if this idea of SETI, of looking for signals that might be being sent our way, if that idea is correct, if it has legs, then this experiment, it's not something for the ages. This is not something that'll work 3 centuries from now. If it's going to work at all, it's going to work in your lifetime. And I think that you should be prepared for that, because what that means is that, you know, for 200,000 years, the history of Homo sapiens, we have liked to think that we are perhaps astronomically or biologically or maybe intellectually special. And we will learn in an instant that none of that is true.
All right, so thank you for that perspective. Now, again, Seth was sharing his views on when we might find a signal, which is a particular kind of life and a more advanced kind of life. I did get an email from Donald Trump this morning assuring me that if we do find a signal, he will build a dome. So rest assured, we have nothing to fear. Donald is here. So with that,
among us, aren't they?
there's a good introduction for you, a good segue for you, Fergal. Maybe get it a little more
I
serious.
had no idea I was going to have to follow Seth Shostak up here. The energy's going to go down just a little bit. I work on the Kepler mission. I'm going to take an approach to this question of radio signals are all very well and good. It would be great if we contacted something, tried to contact us that want to communicate with us. But even among humans, there are far more people than there are people who are emitting radio waves, and there's far more different kinds of life on the Earth than are technologically capable. So a better approach to this, in my opinion, is to start by looking for life of any form at all. And the way I think we should do this, the way I'm going to focus on anyway, is I'm going to talk about life on planets around other stars, life which is outside the solar system. I'm somewhat biased on this. I work for the Kepler mission. It is our job to find planets around solar systems, so we're trying to drum up some business for it. The 2 big results from Kepler, if you haven't heard them, that I want to share with you is, number 1, is that in our galaxy, we now know that there are more planets than stars out there. Now, when I was growing up, when I was reading those astronomy books from the library, we didn't know about any planets out there. There were people who were arguing very logically that planets were very rare. We now know that they are extremely common. More has been work done by a colleague of mine, Chris Burke, who has established that if you just look at the sun-like stars, stars that are like our sun, and you look for planets which are about the same size as the Earth, about the same orbital period of the Earth, take the same amount of time to go around their star, somewhere between 2 and 25% of those sun-like stars has an Earth-like planet by that definition. Now, that's a pretty broad range, you think about it, between 2 and 25%. If you heard that there was a horse that was a 25% chance of winning a race, you might put a bet on it. If you woke up the next morning and discovered there was only a 2% chance, you might be pretty unhappy. But to go from a range of where we had no clue what the number was at all to get to within a factor of 10, as Seth said, a factor of 10 for an astronomer is basically the same number. We've done... And I tell my referees that all the time. So let me go back to that definition a little bit. I said planets which are about the same size as the Earth and about the same orbital period. That's something of an unusual definition of an Earth-like planet. You might talk about trees and waters and mountains and people and stuff. I use that definition because with the Kepler Space Telescope, those are the only 2 properties of the planet we can actually measure. So all those pretty pictures that you see of Kepler planets that show up in the media, that show up in your Facebook feed, they owe more to the imagination of artists than they do to any constraints we can place on the planets themselves. There are things other than the size of the planet and its orbital period which are important. Size is important. If the planet is too big, it's probably a gas giant like Neptune or Jupiter, and there's no rocky surfaces to walk on. If there's life there, it's not life like us. It's not life like we recognize, and we could observe those planets and not understand what we are seeing. The other important thing I talked about, orbital period. If a planet is too close into its parent star, it's going to be too hot, and any water on the surface will boil off. If it's too far away, all that water will freeze into ice. It won't be available for life. One of the few things I know about biology, and I stopped taking biology when I was 14, but every biochemical process we know about takes place within water. We can't imagine any form of life that doesn't involve water. At least I haven't heard about it. Feel free to contradict me in a minute. So we talk about these things, maybe 2%, maybe 20, maybe 1 in 50, maybe 1 in 4 of the planets of the stars out there that are like the sun, host a planet like the Earth. By that definition, there's also important things like atmosphere. What's in the atmosphere? Is it full of poisonous gases? Is it full of nitrogen, like our own atmosphere? Is there water there? Is there any evidence of the sort of gases that life produces that we could detect? And the way to answer this question, the way to move forward from Kepler, is to take what's called a spectrum of the light from a planet. As we're showing in the diagram up there, if you take the light from the Earth and you pass it through a prism, you can see that the light from the planet is brighter and fainter at different colors. That's all that a spectrum is. In the picture that I show up above, I'm showing a spectrum of the Earth starting from green wavelengths all the way out to red, and then pushing further on into light, which is too long of a wavelength for human eyes to see. This is what we call infrared light. This is the light that your remote control in your television uses to work. If you look at this spectrum, you can see a number of lines and bumps and wiggles and glitches in that spectrum. These are caused primarily by molecules in the Earth's atmosphere, which are very interesting to us from the point of view of establishing if there's life on that planet. You can see some of them I've marked off with H2O. That's water. Knowing if there's water on the surface of the planet would be very important for this question. And that big spike down there, just slightly to the right of the middle, that's oxygen. Now, oxygen is a very reactive chemical. If there's not something producing oxygen, that oxygen is going to react with stuff. It's going to disappear on timescales which are short from the point of view of an astronomer. The oxygen on the Earth is being created by life. And so if you take the spectrum of a planet and you see water and you see oxygen, that's very strong evidence that there is life on that planet. So I see this is the way forward into doing this. The problem with this, now, before I go on, I should say there's some astronomers who disagree with this. They say there's possibly other mechanisms of coming up with oxygen. This is not settled science, but I think it's the way forward. Certainly the best approach we have at the moment. The problem is that these planets are very small and faint. They're very far away, and they're very close to a big, bright star. In order to take a spectrum like this of a planet that is not the Earth, you will need to suppress the light from the star by a factor of about 10 billion. That's a lot. People are working on this. They haven't figured out how to do it yet. Looking at those technical challenges, I estimate it's going to take them maybe 20, 30 years to solve that problem, and then maybe another 10 years to get the mission designed, funded, built, and launched. So that's my prediction.
Okay, so I have a special respect for Fergal as an astronomer because think where he grew up. So he grew up in Ireland. He had to take everything on faith that there were even stars. So imagine his surprise when he moved to California. He says, "My God, they were right. There are stars out there. All this studying hasn't been in vain." Okay, so what's your prediction in terms of when? Says the when?
So I asked my friends and other people who work in the Kepler mission, and I heard everywhere from never to 6 years' time.
Okay.
So I'm going to split the difference here. My guess is going to take about maybe 30, 40 years, maybe a little bit longer, to get all the technology developed, funded, built, and launched. So that's going to be my prediction.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, no, I will have to go with Fergal in terms of how we need to look at life in the universe. We need to collapse the walls of just looking for something that looks like us or think like us, etc. Which means that opens new horizon, literally, and that opens new horizon both for the SETI aspect of it or what we call more of the astrobiology, the little guy, the microbe. What Seth doesn't think is an intelligent part of life, but actually, after 4 billion years, led to somebody like you, Seth. So, you do have to think about life as a continuum, and microbial life is going to tell you about intelligent life. But to go to the point of today's discussion about when, I guess that there are two aspects of it. There is the planetary exploration in the past 40 years that has been building on a program, a continuum that shows you, what the geological history of a planet is, what the past climate of a planet can be. Like you see Mars behind me. We have learned from Mars that we have a planet that looks a lot like the Earth. Just look like the Earth, it's not the Earth. But we know that conditions were habitable in the past on Mars. We know that climate was favorable and things change. So Mars is, for me, I don't know if it will be the first place where we find life, but this is the first place we have started to look at habitability, and we're going to start to look for life soon, actually. There is a ExoMars mission on its way now that is going to start to look at spectrum, things that you would like to see, looking for methane, looking for oxygen, signs that life could have been on Mars in the past and now. We know now that we have methane that is seeping out of Mars. Methane can be created in a number of ways. But the interesting thing on Mars, for instance, is that this is a variable signal. And what that means is that it can be an event somewhere. Maybe it can be geological activity, but it can be also related to biological activity. So this hypothesis is very much possible. So definitely in my mind, Mars would be, possibly the first place where we are going to find something, because we have an integrated program that has been helping us understand what its ability was in the past. So Mars had lots of water. It had what Bill was discussing about energy, lots of volcanoes, nutrients in the minerals, but also shelter. And shelter is very important for life. So in the past, you had an atmosphere. It's now gone, but that was the primary shelter for potential life on Mars. So that would be one place where I would be looking for having results sooner rather than later. And then there is obviously, Cassini, and we might talk more about that with Mark, and all the moons that we are discovering in the solar system. And all of a sudden, we discover that there are oceans. We have heat that is generated by gravitational tides from these giant planets, and the shelter is there, and the nutrient is there, is being provided to potential life in the subsurface of these moons and planets through the exchange with the surface. So all of a sudden, in the past 40 years, we came from just having a glimpse of little dots through telescope to having full-blown worlds that we can understand. And what we also understand is that you don't need to be a planet necessarily to be habitable. The notion of habitability has completely changed in the past 40 years. We came from understanding habitability as a distance from a parent star, and you were either inside it or you were outside it. And today, this is not the case anymore. A number of worlds in our own solar system are outside the habitable zone. Yet, they have habitable environment, and very promising one. Oceans, maybe hydrothermal system inside the moons of Enceladus and Europa. So the solar system is really the place where I think, just because we have lots of mission going at them, we'll have sooner rather than later a response to, are we alone? But to Seth's point, we know that there is no intelligent life or technologically intelligent and advanced life in the solar system. But still, we can learn a lot. And, we can learn a lot about how to go and find ET, and find ET faster by understanding how life evolves with its environment. And this is one of the great lessons of astrobiology in the past few decades. We realized that life doesn't just show up like that. But when you have transition from prebiotic chemistry to life, all of a sudden something very strange happens. Life transforms its environment. A planetary environment is going to give you the condition for the physical, chemical condition for life to happen. It will tell you what type of life is possible or not possible. But once life is here, it's going to modify its environment. And so to go back to Fergal's discussion and to Seth's discussion, we have to think in terms of looking for intelligent life and advanced life in terms of coevolution of life and environment, which means that every single planet that we are looking for is going to be a unique experiment. So looking for ET, you are going to look at something that is different. Every time you look at a planet, you are going to look at a different experiment. Is ET looking like us? Who cares? There is probably a lot of intelligent life out there, but it's going to be very different. Are we searching the right way? I don't know. But what I'm saying is that probably the solar system is going to give us the answer first. But by learning what we are learning right now, we will be finding ET sooner, because the answer is also contained in the way we are looking at the solar system.
All right, thank you. Nat, this is what's fascinating about working at a place like the SETI Institute. You can tell perspectives tend to be colored a little bit by the kind of work that's being done. So here's Seth, who won't be happy really until he finds a signal from something that Donald will protect us from. And then we have Fergal, who really won't be happy until we're looking at life on exoplanets. Quite a challenging technical feat. And Nat is focused on microbiological life. Probably, I would agree, the first places we're likely to find the presence of life beyond Earth is right here in our own solar system, and yet of a very basic life form. And with that, Mark, we'd love to get your perspectives.
Okay. Well, I am a physicist and mathematician, so I'm going to take a kind of a mathematical approach to the problem, and I'm going to go for broke with Seth. I want there to be intelligent life in the universe. And so what I did is take this image of the tree of life. It came straight out of Wikipedia, so it has to be true. But I turned it into a kind of a board game. And the idea is that you are a fledgling young planet, and you are sitting there at the base of the tree of life. And the goal of this game is to get to the winner circle, which is in upper right, where there are big brains, intelligence, a creature that can actually look down on that tree of life and say, wow, look at that, that's really cool. There are a couple of checkpoints along the way, and the game is to basically roll the dice and see if we can get past each of those checkpoints. There's something very peculiar, though. I sort of gave away the ending. When Earth played this game, we got all the way to the winner circle, right? We are here. And what that means is that we have a very particular perspective where we can look down on that tree of life. We can look down on that game. We passed all 4 of those checkpoints. We could say, wow, life is easy. I bet life is plentiful on the universe because look at us, we came along. There is a mathematical flaw in that reasoning, and that is that we have what would be called a biased statistical sample. We are looking at ourselves. And you could just imagine sort of taking it to an extreme. Suppose every planet in the universe played this game, and only once did any other planet get into the winner circle and have that intelligent species. That intelligent species would look at its tree of life, and it would say, wow, this game was easy. I bet life is plentiful. But they would be wrong, and for us to make that same argument, it is flawed. We could be wrong about that. So let's just start at the base and play the game. The first question mark that you can see, that's biogenesis, the beginnings of life, some form of life. We know that that happened rather quickly on Earth, and so some people have argued if it happened quickly, it's probably rather likely. I would say that might be right, but on the other hand, we've got to remember that we are in a biased position. If life didn't occur quickly on Earth, then we wouldn't be here to look at it. And therefore, it's a slightly flawed argument to say life is easy just because it appeared quickly. It could be that it does appear and it is a very likely outcome. It could be it is a fantastically improbable outcome. We don't know. The next checkpoint, the next question mark, is a very interesting one, the origin of eukaryotes, which are these more complicated cells, not just the incredibly simple ones that we started with, but the eukaryotes have a nucleus. And the story, as we understand it, is that one day this big archaean was sitting around, and a bacterium came along and sort of found a hole through the membrane and entered into the archaean, and that bacterium took up residence there. It became a mitochondria, the nucleus formed, and that archaean became a eukaryote, the first eukaryote. And we are all descendants of that one event. It took about 2 billion years, so half of the history of the Earth was spent waiting to get from biogenesis to the first eukaryote. And, you know, most of the time when a parasite enters a critter, neither of them turns out to like it very much. So it could be that turn of events was, in fact, incredibly improbable. But complex cells are one of the requirements to get up to the winner circle. The next step, the next question mark there, is basically where sexual reproduction appeared. That means you have 2 parents instead of 1. That means every individual is a unique genome. And once you get to sexual reproduction, evolution explodes. And that's why the yellow piece of that tree has so much variety on it. It has slime molds and it has us and everything in between. And, but that's because of sexual reproduction. It did not have to happen. There are mathematical reasons why asexual reproduction seems to be preferred in a lot of numerical experiments that have been done. So it may be that sex was inevitable, but it may also be that it was fantastically improbable. Finally, you get to life. Now, we could imagine a planet where all evolution ended with elephants and lions and bears, and nobody building radio telescopes. What is it that made that transition so that genus Homo became as intelligent as we are? That's a really tough question, because the thing is, big brains are not the natural end state of evolution. Big brains are big drains on nutrition, on metabolism. There's got to be a good reason for the brain to get that big, and we don't really know why that happened. It could be that intelligence could have been a fairly likely outcome, but on the other hand, intelligence does not seem to be foreordained. It could be fantastically improbable. So you put that all together, and my bottom line is that I don't know when we're going to get to any of these points, how often they occur, but mathematically what I worry about are the biases when we ask these questions. My colleagues are very optimistic, and I hope they are right, but that's my bias. Consider that we see life everywhere on Earth, everywhere we look. It is built into our brains. So not only are we biased by living on a statistically unusual sample, Earth, we are biased because we see life everywhere. And if we see life everywhere on Earth, then we're a lot more inclined to see life off the Earth. And we're a lot more inclined to want to see life off the Earth. So that's a bias that we have to look at very, very closely. So my concern is that if we play this game, even if one or two of those steps in the process, one of those gates that we had to cross, turns out to be fantastically improbable, then there is a lot less life in this universe than we want there to be. And looking at the solar system and looking for ET might just take a long time, not because our technology isn't capable, not because we're going to interesting places, but because it's just not there yet, or not there currently. So if I had to predict, I would say there's a 50-50 chance that my colleagues are right and that we'll see life in the next century, and there's a 50-50 chance that we'll see life never. And the reason we have to study this problem is because we could be alone in the universe, and the stakes are so high that we really have to answer that question.
And that's what the SETI Institute is all about, in a nutshell. So actually very interesting, as now you know we're all related, so we're all family here. We all are descendant from the Eukaryotes, and we have cousins who are slime mold. So this is a good example of why, you know, the family photo album isn't always that attractive. But, so I'd like to start off with a question to the panel. It seems clear to me that finding life of any type at its most basic level would be a transformative moment in human history. Do you believe it would be equally transformative if we were to find evidence of past life, not necessarily current living life, for example, on Mars? That if we could find the clear, solid evidence that life had been there, but it is not there now?
I don't know why you're looking at me like that. This is a very important point, Bill. I guess that Mars is definitely the closest planet to ours. Very different, but similar enough that we can think that life, you know, as we know it, could have evolved on it. And there are a number of possibilities on Mars in terms of past life. The first one is that life evolved on Mars, and it was all different. The environment was similar, but it evolved something. And so it is there. It means that there is a second genesis on the second planet of a system of 8. And that starts telling you a little bit more about your game, Mark, about the statistics of life, at least in our solar system. Can we expand further? That's another question, but at least that gives us something to start on. The second one is that, of course, nothing happened on Mars, and this is another conclusion. Can we expand that to the universe? I don't know. Finding microbial life on Mars that relates to us, to me, is probably as close as exciting as finding a second genesis. And here's the reason why. Mars and the Earth have exchanged a lot of material when they were forming, just because of orbital mechanics. It's easy for rocks from Mars to go to the Earth, and it's somewhat less easy, but feasible for pieces of Earth to go to Mars. And so as they were forming, the two planets exchanged a lot of material. So let's imagine that they were seeded by exactly the same material. And that, life started on Mars and life started on Earth. Maybe we are Martian, maybe they are Earthlings. We don't know, but we are cousins. And this becomes really important for us because we don't know what life is, and we don't know how it started on Earth. And we will never know. We will never know for the same reason as we're here today. Our planet is a very dynamic planet, and tectonics and geology have erased the record of all the ancient rocks that were at the beginning of the history of the Earth. And so the oldest one we found so far are 4.1 billion years old, and already we have potential traces that life was there. As Mark said, life started very early on. But the time when prebiotic chemistry transitioned to life, this record is gone from our planet. And if we're sharing some seeding material with Mars, Mars doesn't have plate tectonics. The geological activity was much less, which means that somewhere in an outcrop sitting on Mars, you might have the record of how prebiochemistry came to be life, and that would help us understand how we came to be. So this would be profound in a number of levels.
You asked for the reaction. Come in. It doesn't matter whether you hear this, actually. You asked for the reaction, Bill, but I think that experiment has been run. For those of you who can remember the biggest science news story of 1996, and that's all of you, right? That was the claim that they had found fossilized Martian microbes in a rock that was picked up in Antarctica. And what was the reaction to that? 4 days straight, big headlines in the New York Times in font that hasn't been used since, that you could read from low-flying aircraft, right? The public was extraordinarily interested, and this was life that had presumably been dead for 4 billion years. So I think that the reaction would be substantial.
And knowledge would be profound for us, because once again, the record is gone here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's like being an orphan and looking at photo pictures and finding a net or some relative somewhere and, learning who you are that way.
When we talk about candidates for life, not only do we have, of course, Mars, and particularly those regions just below the poles of Mars where there still appears to be liquid water evident. Other candidates that come to mind are Europa, which is getting a lot of attention. There are NASA missions planned to explore Europa, but also Enceladus, the moon of Saturn. Would anybody in the panel care to comment on what they believe might be found when we get a closer look at those moons?
Well, I can speak to Enceladus in particular. I know that at least there are very, very preliminary plans to actually send a mission out to Enceladus. Enceladus, by the way, a small, about 300-kilometer moon of Saturn, which has geysers. It has essentially cracks in its southern hemisphere where sprays of salty water, or salty ice, in fact, are coming out, and they've been detected directly by the Cassini spacecraft, which has been orbiting Saturn since 2004. There are very preliminary technological thoughts about how to actually take a spacecraft, send it to Enceladus, and then drop a probe, essentially a submersible probe, into the interior ocean of Enceladus through one of those cracks, which are not very deep, as we learn. And it would be the easiest and shortest way to actually take a look inside one of these oceans. Inside many of the satellites and planets in the distant dwarf planets have an interior salty ocean that could be the right kind of place for life to form. So imagine maybe in a few decades beyond other people's horizons, we're actually looking at the undersea environment in Enceladus and seeing little critters swimming around. And that would be one of those great moments of proof that there's actually frequent biogenesis in the universe.
Alan Stern was asked before New Horizons got to Pluto, what is he going to find there? And he said, we will find something wonderful. And I think if we send a probe to Europa or Enceladus and we get under that ice crust, whatever we find will be wonderful. If we find life, that answers this question. If we don't find life, we've got the conditions that are perfect for life, and we can start wondering, why didn't it form? And that'll give us, start to give us some sort of insight into how common it is that biogenesis happens in other places around the galaxy. So I think that would be one of the really cool things for NASA to do.
Fergal, I will go with what you are saying by adding that we need to look at our solar system as a natural lab to understand who we are, where are we coming from, but also what life could be outside the solar system. Although I think that there might be more biochemistry than what's feasible in our solar system. But definitely we need to use what we have. This is our Rosetta Stone. This is where we are. This is who we are. And so we need to use it to understand what's beyond us.
Saturn is a lot closer than the nearest star.
That's right.
That's the good news. So we've had some interesting perspectives here. I hope you've enjoyed this. We want to get maybe some discussion going. Before we do that, it's worth observing that, as you would expect, it's very difficult to pin down a scientist in the absence of data. Very data-driven. And so, we've had kind of wide-ranging guesses. You notice that there's nobody who's actually gone on record and say, here's when. So, in the parlance of the game show host, I would say, thank you for playing. I'll go ahead and share a perspective that I think that within 30 years from now, we will find evidence of life within our own solar system. I'm not sure whether that's on Mars. The polar regions are going to be explored, we hope, by a mission yet to be funded, but in the works, called Icebreaker, which is a probe that they hope to launch and land on Mars, launch in 2024. There are missions planned for Europa. Not sure if there's missions at this point planned for Enceladus, but
They're in the works.
They're in the
works.
works, yeah.
so I'm of the opinion that within 30 years, we're going to find evidence that, to the point made earlier by the panel, that life formed early on Earth. It seems that the ingredients were there early on for at least basic life to evolve. I think Mark raises some interesting points about the ultimate evolution of life into the species who can ask this question. But basic life, I'd like to believe, is more prevalent than we can imagine. So another thing before we open it up to questions, not only is this a competitive sport, but we're involved in a competitive sport in terms of our fundraising efforts today. So I noticed that we've dropped to 4th place on the leaderboard here, which is a result of the fact that you guys are all in here and just enthralled by what you're hearing and nobody's out there. So we hope that to be changing. What's particularly depressing is that the number 1 is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
They should come here. Come on.
I don't know what that says about Silicon Valley, but maybe it sums it all up in one nice thing. So anyway, please remember us on Silicon Valley Gives Day and see if we can move up the leaderboard. What I'd like to do now is open up the floor to questions. We have a microphone up in the front. If you have questions for our panelists, please make your way to the microphone if you can. If that's too difficult, we can probably get a microphone. Maybe Lee, could we arrange to get a microphone for people who seem to be trapped in the middle? First,
from David Morrison. For searching for life in the solar system, whether Mars or elsewhere, I have not seen any evidence that anyone has figured out how to build a life detection instrument. What would it be? What would it do? If we can't bring the stuff back, what could you analyze that would tell you whether something either was alive or had once been alive?
That's a very good point, and that goes back to the question, David, that we don't know what life is. We know when we see it. And we are searching for something we don't know. And basically what we are trying to do right now is to go to places, and one way of doing this is going to places we believe are good analog to those planetary environments that we want to visit. And we are developing instruments that are trying to figure out, what would be left in an environment that is high radiation, what would be left in the ice, etc. So right now we're putting instruments together. Unless you have a rabbit that is going to jump in front of your rover on Mars, or something that is going to fly in front of your camera as you are crossing the geysers of Enceladus, it is going to be down to biochemistry. And so it is extremely difficult to get an instrument package that is small enough that is going to give you the information you need. But this is what we need to do now. And that also tells us that we need to bring back those samples. We need to have the capability. We need to have the resources to bring the stuff back on Earth, because it's always going to be better than what we can put on a spacecraft. So right now you have all sorts of instruments. You have Raman spectrometer looking for organics. You have something else looking for pigments that go with the Raman. You have biosignatures that are morphological, that are chemical, that are physical, that, name it. But you cannot have any one thing taken alone that is going to tell you this is alive.
Okay, I have a question for Seth, I think. Our other panel members may contribute too. But I'm working with some of the ATA data, and my bias has been that when we find the signal, it won't take very long to figure out what it means. But I'm reading a science fiction story by Gregory Benford, where somewhat in the future, the Earth and the Moon are awash with ET signals, and nobody's figured out any of them. So my question for you is, when will the signal be decoded once it's been detected?
All right, Jeff asks, when will we decode the signal? I appreciate your optimism, Jeff, in assuming that we will find the signal. For those of you who are technically inclined, and I suppose that's a large fraction of you, the reason that you don't get the message right away, you don't get the bits, is because, of course, we average the incoming cosmic static over seconds or minutes or whatever the integration period is in order to find weaker stuff. It's like making a time exposure at night with your camera. You lose all the temporal information. So the bits, which are presumably coming in at billions, or millions at least, millions of times a second, like a TV signal, they all go away. But if you announce tomorrow, hey, we picked up a signal coming from 847 light years away from that star system over there, I think money will no longer be a problem, okay? And this should worry our fundraiser perhaps, but money will no longer be a problem because you will get the money to build a very much bigger instrument that can have the sensitivity to find those bits. Now, how long after that do you finally figure out what they mean? Because they're not going to send an empty signal into space unless it's a very short signal saying, we're here, let us know you're there. Otherwise, they're going to send info. They're very far away. They're not going to wait for you to get back to them. They're going to send everything. They're going to send a lot of stuff. And I think that what you would do at that point is you would take all these bits and you would put them on the internet. And it would be like decoding the hieroglyphics. That was done very quickly because there was a lot of material. And if there presumably be a lot of material and you have the whole world working on it, and could they ever figure it out? I don't know. Personally, I'm somewhat skeptical that they'll ever figure it out or will ever figure it out, because to me it's like giving Neanderthals, right, a digital television signal. Neanderthals were not that stupid, but they would never figure it out. But that's okay. Even if you don't figure it out, at least you know you have company.
Well, maybe you'd finally be able to beat the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and funding.
Maybe they will decode it for us.
Hope springs eternal.
So my question is at the other end of the spectrum, which is back to exchanging rocks with possible evidence of the transition to biochemistry. Is it possible to look on the moon? Because that's even closer than Mars. I mean, presumably we doesn't have the gravity, but we exchange rocks with the moon.
Yeah.
Would it be likely that if we looked on, say, the near surface of the moon, we might find some?
Yeah, exchange of material, actually, it is much easier to get material from Mars to the Earth than it is to get material from the moon to the Earth. Because anything that is on the moon, on Mars, is basically orbiting the sun, and it just goes off in some pathway, it gets banged off Mars, and then the Earth gets in the way and it lands. If something comes off the moon, it's still orbiting the Earth, and you have to get rid of all that spiraling energy until you get it down to the Earth. So when we find extraterrestrial meteorites that come from the solar system, they are much more often from Mars than they are from the moon. But that being said, we actually have pieces of the moon already. We can go there and get them, or we can wait for them to fall. They do fall occasionally. I'm sure they have been analyzed in the same way that chunk of Mars was analyzed that apparently was thought to contain fossils but did not, and that was certainly a worthwhile avenue.
Yeah, but what about Earth rocks maybe landing on the moon?
Well, it's actually, this is a dynamics problem, so this is where I know this stuff. Getting stuff off the Earth is much harder than either the Mars or the moon because we've got a bigger gravity. So it's much more likely, for example, for life to form on Mars and then accidentally seed the Earth than for life to form on Earth and then accidentally seed Mars, because getting material off of Earth is much more difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will add something that goes back to David's question as well, is that the reason why we would prefer to search on Mars is because Mars is going to give you context. And it is really difficult to understand what's alive and what's not, or what was alive and is not anymore. You need context for that. And finding a rock that has been dumped by an impact and an ejecta somewhere randomly at the surface of a planet is not going to help with trying to reconstruct the conditions and the environment this rock and this record was formed in.
Right.
Okay, so sacrilegious question, and it actually turns out it follows the previous questioner. Have we ever considered seeding one of these planets with some life form to verify that we are right and it can in fact support life?
Marge!
Marge, is that allowed?
Can somebody get the mic to
Yeah,
Marge?
get the mic
I
to
think
Marge.
she has the answer to this question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
My name is Margaret Race, and I work on planetary protection, which is the biology of...
This is
and
the
science
planetary
policy.
police.
My boss is the planetary police. But anyway, so United Nations Outer Space Treaty is something that we've all been using to set policy for how we go into space. And there's Article 9 of the treaty says no harmful cross-contamination. And harmful is in terms of what you're doing to the science that you're going to do as well. So if you would seed something on purpose that could then perhaps spread there, that's not a good thing. So we are very careful in what we do to spacecraft before they go to a place like Mars. And so while it has been proposed that you do experiments inside a dome or something like that, right now you wouldn't do that. Although when they're talking about sending humans to Mars, that issue is coming up. What do we do about humans who go along with all of their microbes? So stay tuned.
Yeah, there's a
if we
shortcut to that. You can do lab experiment in Mars chambers, for
Yes,
instance,
and the
on
other
Earth.
thing, if we find life up there, I don't know what that says. Does that mean that Mars belongs to Martians? And what do we? And if Mars is different than that chart of life as we know it, does that make it a second Genesis? So then you go into ethical questions and theological questions. So it's science, technology, and lots of other things that come up.
Thanks very much, Marge. So you can rest assured that not only do we have scientists working on these questions, but we also have the planetary police making sure that we do so carefully. Terry.
Okay, Terry Turman, yeah. I have a question for Fred Mullaly. You said it would take about 40 years to be able to block the light of a central star by a factor of 10 billion to see its planets. I've seen a proposal that looks like for a star blocker that would be about 50 miles from the telescope and block the light. It looks like a big circle with a lot of pointy, it's like a sunflower with a lot of pointy petals around a big circle. And this is the design, and I presume it's well thought out. And isn't this really a budget issue rather than a design issue to see planets around stars?
Yeah, so the idea you're talking about is an occulter, and it is basically, the idea, it's very simple, is you have a big telescope out in space, and then you put a big shade further out in space blocking the light of the star. And because of the unusual properties of light when you treat it as a wave, if you shape that sunshade just the right shape, light from this very central star will get blocked, but light from a very small ring around it will still survive. So the history of this, just to go back a bit, originally people said, we're going to use the properties of light and build something called an interferometer. So we've got multiple telescopes in space, and we'll combine the light just right so we block out the light from the star. It's going to be easy. So NASA said, all right, here's a bunch of money. Go do that. And they came back a few years later and said, well, that's a bit harder than what we thought, but look, we've got this great idea. We built something called a coronagraph. We put this little thing to block the light deep inside the spacecraft. And I said, all right, here's some money. Go figure out how that works. And they came back and said, well, it turns out that's a little bit harder than we thought as well. But we could build an occulter. And at that stage, sort of the enthusiasm from NASA for funding the money to establish the feasibility of that had sort of died off a little bit. And so this does seem to be our best approach at the moment toward solving this problem. But to say that it's technologically solved yet is a bit premature. People still have to work and still have to make sure that it does work. Because it'll be a lot of money to do. Yeah.
But it's more than...
Use
his hand up back. But Terry, it's more than just budget because it isn't 50 miles. The distance between the telescope and the occulter is thousands of miles. Somebody have a better number. It's a very, very big distance, and that means now you have to coordinate these two things when you want to point this instrument. So that's a problem too.
Yeah. So if you do build one of these, you'll spend most of your time not finding planets with this spacecraft because you're waiting to get that occulter into just the right place. Some people see that as an advantage. One cosmologist says, and then while you're moving the occulter into place, you can do some real science. That's when I lost all interest in this project.
So before we jump to the next question, I know it's a little after 1. We may lose some of our friends from Microsoft. I do want to thank any of you who have to leave at this point very much for attending and joining us. I do hope that those of you at Microsoft will remember that if you are interested in supporting the work of the SETI Institute, your donation today goes a lot further because your employer is going to match, and we're so grateful for Microsoft's support and for your attendance. So thank you for that. We have been, as well, by courtesy of Microsoft, been granted a little extra time here. So we're going to go about another 5-6 minutes of Q&A till about 1:15, and with that, you have the microphone.
Yeah, so my question was, earlier you were talking about looking at red dwarf stars. Maybe my question is more inspired by science fiction than science, but I read that the planets are usually tidally locked and You know, one side is always always day, and the other side is always the night. So how do you have life in such a place?
It-
Intelligent one.
it's yeah, the morality
test.
police have silenced
Hard to
me.
keep Seth down, but we're learning how.
Yeah, the question is a good one, and that is, if you have a planet around a red dwarf star, that red dwarf star is really pretty dim. The planet has to be very close in order to be habitable, in order to be able to have liquid oceans. But if it's that close in, it's going to get tidally locked, just like the moon. One side of that planet's always facing the star. The other side is always facing away from the star. So the far side will be very cold. The atmosphere will freeze out in useless heaps of snow and ice on the ground, and that's it. It's dead, Jim. Well, that was the view 15 years ago, but since then people have done studies, and these people can probably talk about that, in which they show, look, if you really have a planet like that, the winds will carry some of the heat from the hot side to the back side. If you have oceans, the ocean currents will carry some of the heat from the hot side to the back. So the atmosphere won't freeze out, and sure, it's too hot on the near side and too cold on the far side, but in between, it's like Northern California.
There's going to be could be a very narrow habitable zone just around the night side,
Right, yeah,
just at dusk.
Housing will be dear.
Like California.
A planet, a rocky planet in the habitable zone of an M star is a very different environment from the Earth. The stars are much more active. They're spewing out these flares, there's explosions on the surface, there's a high energy radiation. It will be a very different environment from the Earth. But that goes back to what Mark was saying. Just because it's a different environment, it might be life which is different to us in many ways, but there could still be life there. So to me, it's a big open question. It's what we would find if we actually got to land a probe on a habitable zone planet around an M star.
You can make the argument if you have a habitable stripe on a habitable zone planet, you're actually much more interested in finding more room. So you may just be saying, is anybody out there with more space than we have here? Question.
I would like to ask, to what extent are you using the origin of life on Earth to inform your search for life elsewhere? In particular, I'm referring to some recent progress they've made with white smokers under the ocean. There's one group that seems to think that they have managed to duplicate the Krebs cycle, the energy production within a cell, using just white smokers. Thank you.
Yeah, well, once again, I'm not a biologist, but where I can respond to your question is that definitely what we are learning from Earth, it really helps us design and conceive the type of search we want to do on other planets. And when you have an environment like Mars that tells you, there was water, then there was this, and there was that, there was energy, we had volcanoes, we have hydrothermal springs, we're finding the evidence of that, then you can go back to the type of life you know on Earth. But it's never a problem to find environments that you can relate to. I think that what is harder for us is to conceive something we don't know. But in fact, what's going to happen is that 99% of the universe and probably the solar system is something we don't know. And so that goes back to the whole discussion here. Yes, let's use our solar system as a natural lab, as a way to conceive ways to search for life as we know it, understanding that life as we know it is only probably a very small fraction of what's out there.
Mike Fisher, what do we know about the origins of the tardigrade?
The tree of life, prebiotic chemistry to life. The origin of the tardigrade, what I know about the tardigrade, and once again, I am not a biologist, but what I know about them is that you can fry them, you can freeze them, you can expose them to the vacuum of space, and it seems that they are absolutely immortal. They are indestructible. So there is definitely something we need to look into their biology and how they can adapt and survive, because we might have a number of clues here, not only on how could we ourselves survive, these conditions, or even as they go dormant for a long time, possibly travel into space, or survive in different planetary environment. So I don't know about the origin of the tardigrade. I know that, I've learned somewhere that people say that they are aliens, actually. because we don't understand them. So to me, that's the easy answer. We don't understand they are alien, like we don't understand the Pyramid of Giza, so they were built by aliens. We haven't met yet, but they are responsible for a number of things already. But tardigrades are an extreme version of adaptability on our planet, and they are telling us something about, how we came to be, but also how we could spread and survive extreme condition in space and out there.
I'd like to invite you to comment on what seems to me to be the tragedy of SETI. That is, the universe, or at least the galaxy, is so large that the likelihood that somebody is out there who will be detectable in the signal is pretty good. But if and when that's detected, we shall have to realize that we have no hope whatever of interacting with it.
If I can interact with you. Well, I'm not quite as pessimistic, right? Within 1,000 light years, there are millions of star systems, so there might be somebody within 1,000 light years. And if they, they'll know that our planet has life thanks to the kind of experiments that have been discussed here. They can see the oxygen in our atmosphere and stuff like that. And they may say, it's worth occasionally sending them a transmission with some information. Because they're far away, hundreds, maybe 1,000 light years away, I think they would send a lot of information because you're not going to get into an easy conversation with anybody that far away. Is that interaction? I mean, I studied Latin in high school. It took 2,000 years for Cicero's words to get to me, but it's still interesting. And I can't talk back to Cicero. I can, but my psychiatrist says I shouldn't. But I consider that interaction. You're not going to meet them. Yes, I agree with that. But you might learn something.
I have, by the way, when the doors closed in Seth's office, I've heard Latin being uttered, so I think he's trying. I have not told his psychiatrist, however. All right, well, with that, I think we've come up to the end of our time. I'd like to thank our panelists and have you join me in thanking them for this lively discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope we've made some new friends and found some new supporters today. Don't forget the Mercury, not Venus, transit on Monday. Join us for coffee and donuts if you'd like to take a look through a telescope and see that firsthand. Thanks again, everybody.